Really quickly, before we get into the video, I just want to say I'm not a professional. I've only been keeping 2 geckos for 1 year now, and most of this knowledge just comes from things I've learned online over the course of about 4 to 5 years. So, I'm not a professional, but I'm pretty confident in what I do know. One more thing is the fact that this is a listen to it video, so turn this on and then, clean up your room or something. There's nothing on screen you need to watch. Hello guys, in today's Let's Talk Reptiles, I'm going to be talking about just reptiles in general. So basically, what you should expect when you get a certain kind of reptile and just all kinds of general stuff. Also, whenever I'm talking about reptiles, I'm mainly referring to lizards and stuff, not snakes, because I just don't have much experience with them. Really quickly, before we get into the video though, I want to say this video is inspired by Exotic Animal Keeper on TikTok. You do not need to watch this person's content to understand this video at all, but the idea popped into my head while watching one of their videos. So if you're actually watching this video, Exotic Animal Keeper, I want to say thanks for it. You gave me the inspiration for this video. Go check out their channel in the description down below, and without any actual further ado, let's get into the video. So the first part of this video is going to be, are reptiles right for you? We're going to talk about the ups and downs of keeping reptiles, and if you should even do it, because reptiles are definitely not meant for everybody. Most people would probably be suited to keeping a dog or a fish instead of a lizard. We're going to go ahead and start with the ups. So, one of the upsides to keeping a reptile would be the fact that they're not going to take up a load of space in your house. Assuming you only have a few reptiles, or even just one, it's not going to take up that much space. Another upside would be, as long as the reptile is not, say, a monitor or an iguana, it's not going to be extremely expensive to care for throughout its entire life, at least in comparison to some larger animals like dogs, cats, or even larger reptiles. The third up is the fact that they're very low maintenance. These are not the kind of animals that are going to require your care day in and day out. They're the kind of animals where you could sit back and chill for a day or two and they will be perfectly fine. And then you pop in, you feed them, you give them their maintenance, take about 10 minutes, and then you're done. And you can enjoy looking at your animal, or if it's even handleable, handling your animal. So they're just very low maintenance overall. So this up could also be considered a down depending on how you look at it. Most reptiles are going to live a relatively long time. Some are going to live very short lives, whereas others could live decades. So depending on how long you want to keep the animal, this could be considered an up or a down. Of course though, if you're not prepared to keep an animal that'll live 20 years, then don't get the animal. If you're not ready to care for an animal for its expected lifespan, then just don't get it to begin with. Now we're going to go ahead and get into the downs. Now the first down I have to mention is it's going to smell bad. You're not going to buy an animal, put it in a glass box, and then let it poop everywhere and expect it to smell good. Of course, there are things you can do to lessen the smell, although at the end of the day, you're going to be smelling animal poop most likely. With that being said, unless you're standing right next to the tank or you have your nose in it, you're probably not going to smell it, because it should not, fill the entire room with the stench of reptile poop. It just shouldn't happen. And if that is happening and you can smell it in your entire room, your reptile probably has some kind of infection or something causing its poop to smell very bad. Also, depending on what the reptile is eating, that may be the source of the stench. So it might not be an infection, and it might just be what your little buddy is eating for breakfast every morning. Now, this isn't really a down, although it kind of is. You're going to have to buy multiple kinds of bugs to feed to your reptile. So if you're squeamish and you don't like cockroaches or crickets and stuff like that, then you're probably not going to want to keep a reptile, because you are going to have to feed them all different kinds of bugs. So if you don't like insects, do not get a reptile. The third down is the fact that you are very likely not going to be able to touch your reptile friend. It's very likely going to be a you get to look at it and it's not going to run away kind of friendship. That's the best it gets for most reptiles. If you're really lucky and you get a very friendly reptile and you eventually gain its trust, you might be able to play with your reptile and handle it for very short periods of times. But on most occasions, it's going to be a look, do not touch pet. And depending on what kind of reptile you get, they will either be way more prone to handling or way less prone to handling. like say a leopard gecko, they are going to be much easier to tame and become your buddy. Whereas a, say, giant Madagascar day gecko or a tokay gecko is going to be much less prone to handling and is probably going to be near impossible to ever pull out of its tank unless you're cleaning it. The fourth down is the fact that these guys are going to have a relatively expensive startup cost. Assuming you buy everything brand new, it's probably going to cost you $500 to $400 for a decent sized tank. Now, assuming you buy stuff secondhand, like the tank and the lighting fixture and other stuff like that, you could probably cut costs to around $250, although you're still going to likely have to buy a UVV bulb for your reptile, a heating bulb for your reptile, and all kinds of vitamins and other such. So it's still going to be pretty expensive to start out with a reptile. Another way to cut costs could be finding your decorations outside. Instead of buying wood online or at a pet store, find it outside and sanitize it. Now, this does come with risks because you are bringing something from outside into your reptile's tank, although as long as you sanitize it very thoroughly, you should have no problems and you get a $50 piece of wood for $3, which is just the best. The last down is the fact that you are not going to be able to get your reptile immediately when you want it. You're very likely going to have to wait upwards of a month after setting up the tank to let it all settle down and make sure it's just fine and good for your reptile to go into it. Also, if you're getting, say, springtails or isopods to go into your tank to make it bioactive, which I would recommend, you're going to have to wait a month for them to settle in. So it can take a little while before you're actually able to purchase your reptile. This next section is going to talk about the differences between handleable and non-handleable reptiles, besides the obvious of one you can touch and the other you can't. Now, real quick, I do want to mention you should do a much more thorough research yourself on what kind of animal you're going to be getting, and if that animal is or is not handleable, because even though I'm talking about some general stuff here, this general stuff might not apply to the animal you want to get, so make sure you do your own thorough research into the animal and whether it is or is not handleable. Now, we're going to start off with non-handleable reptiles and why you might want to get one. There are basically no upsides to having a non-handleable reptile, and there are only a few downsides. The main one being the fact that you're probably going to have a harder time removing your animal for either checking on it, say taking it to a vet, or cleaning out its tank. So it's going to make that a little bit more difficult, but besides that, there's not really any other downsides or upsides. So basically, if a reptile is non-handleable, but you really want it, it's going to take a little bit more effort to take care of it, but that's basically it. Now we're going to talk about why you should get a handleable reptile. The first and most obvious reason is they're going to be a lot easier to remove from the tank for maintenance on the tank or taking them to the vet or something like that. So basically, when it comes to moving the reptile, it's going to be a lot easier and stress-free on you and the reptile and just make everything just that much easier. The second reason is obviously you want to hold your animal. For some people, looking at their animal is more than enough for them, including me, but for some people, they want to hold their animals because they're putting in all of this work taking care of it and keeping it nice and healthy and happy, so they want to get it out and mess with it for a little bit and pet it, take videos, whatever they want to do. Handleable reptiles are going to be much less prone to stress and hurting themselves. So if you want to mess with your pet, you want to get out, take videos, and do whatever with it, you're definitely going to want to get a handleable reptile so that way you don't accidentally hurt it in the process. Some examples of handleable reptiles would be leopard geckos, bearded dragons, blue-tongued skinks, stuff like that. Most of those reptiles are relatively chill, but once again, it's going to come down to doing your own research. You don't want to just get a reptile and hope it's nice and sweet. You want to look into it and make sure you know whether you're going to be able to pet it and not kill it in the process. This next segment is going to be a little bit more in depth on the diet of reptiles in general. So what can you be expecting to feed your little lizard friend? We're going to go ahead and start talking about it with, like, say, a bearded dragon. So a bearded dragon, you're going to be expecting to feed it leafy greens and stuff like that, and you're also going to have to feed it a very diverse diet of all kinds of insects. meaning like silkworms, mealworms, crickets, all kinds of roaches. So they have to have a very diverse diet. You can't just stick to feeding your reptile a single insect for its entire life, or a single leafy green. You need to change it up every once in a while, so that way they're getting a very diverse diet. Also, you do not want to feed them, say, silkworms or mealworms all the time, or even all that often, because bugs like that are extremely fatty and will lead to health issues in your animal. So you also want to research the feeders you're feeding to your animal, because you do not want to be feeding it extremely unhealthy bugs extremely often. Another way to say it would be, imagine giving a toddler ice cream every day and nothing but ice cream for 2 weeks. It's not good for the toddler, obviously, and that's not something you should do. So you shouldn't give your bearded dragon the equivalent of ice cream, aka silkworms, mealworms, stuff like that, every single day, because it's just not good for them. And this rule basically applies to everything. Think of a crested gecko. Crested geckos mostly eat wet food, but when they do have insects, you want to make sure you're giving them a diverse selection of insects. Or a leopard gecko. They don't really eat leafy greens, they don't eat wet food, they only really eat bugs. And you want to make sure you give them a diverse selection. So no matter what kind of reptile it is, you're going to want to give them a diverse selection of food. And depending on the reptile you end up getting, it could change which insects should be their primary food. Because even though you're giving them a diverse selection, you should still have a staple in their diet. Some instances of a good staple would be, say, dubia roaches or just like banded crickets. Those are relatively low-fatty options and just overall good to be a staple in your reptile's diet. Now, they're not exactly the best because, like I said, you do want to give them a diverse diet, but it's okay to feed them mostly those because they are relatively healthy for your reptile. Okay, our next section is going to talk about the different size categories of reptiles. So I'm going to go over like some small reptiles, some examples of how to care for those in general, then some medium reptiles and how to care for those in general, and then larger reptiles and what to expect. And then the last section is just going to be ginormous reptiles and what to expect, which I seriously doubt anybody watching this video is even considering getting. So like I said, the first section is going to be about small reptiles. So in general, the smallest possible tank you could expect to possibly get is like a 12 by 12 by 12 enclosure, and really the only reptiles you could get is like a mourning gecko, a house gecko, some green or brown anoles, and that's really about it. There are not that many reptiles that can go in that small of a tank, and in general, even those should probably be stuck in a 18 by 18 by 24 enclosure, which is roughly 30 gallons. Whereas 12 by 12 by 12, I believe, is about 10 to 15 gallons. So really, you can't get away with anything smaller than a 12 by 12 by 12 for any reptile at all. And when it comes to caring for smaller reptiles, it's relatively easy. All you need to do is, expect to feed them very small amounts of food. So if you have geckos, you're going to be feeding them a very small amount of wet food. If you have, like, anoles, you're going to be feeding them a very small amount of crickets or roaches. So it's going to be very easy to maintain these smaller reptiles, even though it might be a little bit more difficult to actually, like, say, handle them or something because of their small size. Now we're going to talk about medium reptiles. So in my opinion, out of all of the sizes, mediums are the best. So like leopard geckos, crested geckos, and like some skinks would fit into this category, like a fire skink or something like that. In general, they're the best size to handle. So if you want to handle your reptile, you're going to probably want a medium-sized one, because it's very likely that you will not hurt them in the process of handling them, and they won't hurt themselves because they're just big enough to where you won't accidentally, say, squish them or something while holding them. And in general, it's still not very hard to care for them and do maintenance on their tank. They're not going to require a massive enclosure. They're going to require bare minimum, which of course I wouldn't recommend, 18 by 18 by 24 enclosure for, say, a crested gecko, and probably, I'd say, a 40-gallon for a leopard gecko or a fire skink. Also, when it comes to feeding them, it's still not that difficult. It's relatively easy because they are pretty small still. A medium reptile should only be about maybe 6 to 12, 13 inches. and they shouldn't be too expensive or bad to feed at all. Now we're going to talk about large reptiles. So in my opinion, a large reptile would be anything that is like 13 inches to 24. That is a large reptile. When it comes to feeding a large reptile, it's obviously going to actually start to cost you a little bit, especially if it's like a bearded dragon where you have to constantly buy fresh leafy greens and a bunch of insects. So the cost can rack up if you have a larger reptile, but even then it shouldn't be that bad because it is just a lizard and not a dog or a cat. Also, if you have, say, a Leachianus gecko, the cost can also rack up on their food because they are going to be eating a relatively large amount of wet food. And say a blue-tongued skink, which is also another large reptile, is going to also eat a large amount of leafy greens and bugs, just like a bearded dragon. So costs can get a little bit more with larger reptiles, but still it's perfectly manageable. And when it comes to tank size for these guys, you're probably looking at a 4 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot enclosure, or upwards of 125 gallons. Keep in mind, these guys are very large. I do believe with the Leachianus gecko, though, you can get away with an 18 by 24, although I'm not really sure. I think you should need at least a bare minimum of 55-gallon probably front opening tank for those guys. They are very large geckos. Now, the last category, absolutely massive reptiles. So this is going to be like most monitor species because they get 24 inches and up. I mean, they get massive. And then also iguanas, because they also get relatively massive. When it comes to an animal like this, it's going to cost you to feed them first off because they're going to be eating lots of leafy greens and all kinds of bugs. It's going to get expensive. Even for a reptile, it might be more expensive than feeding a dog or cat at that point because they are just so large. And also, as far as space goes, you're going to have to dedicate a room to these guys. I mean, it's going to be 12 foot by 12 foot by like 6 foot. Bare minimum sized enclosures for a full-grown iguana or some monitors. I mean, they get massive. I have seen most monitors kept in like a 4 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot, but in my opinion, that's still way too small because they get absolutely massive. They get like, I think, 6 to 4 feet. They get huge. Everything I'm saying about really, really large reptiles, though, is purely off of what I've seen online because I am A, never going to keep them, and B, I have never kept them. So just, do your own research if you're even considering getting them, but just do not get an iguana, do not get a monitor. They get way too big, especially as your first reptile. No, just get them 20 years down the line if you're bored and you want something interesting. Otherwise, just do not get very, very large reptiles. Now, this entire segment is just going to be about where to do your research. So, to start off with, just do your research on whatever animal. So, decide on what animal you want to get, then do your research into it, and do not be like afraid to switch animals. If you decide halfway through researching an animal it's just not right for you, then find another animal that is right for you, or just don't get an animal to begin with. You do not want to research an animal, not like it, and decide that you've already put in all this time researching it, and then end up getting it and neglecting the animal. So make sure you know what animal you're getting, you know what you're getting into, and you know you're going to absolutely love it, and just make sure you do thorough research. There are many places where you can do research, of course. I mean, go on Google, look up, the animal you want to do, how to take care of it, so and such, its requirements, how to feed it, all that stuff. It's very widely available information, especially for like bearded dragons, leopard geckos, stuff like that, because they're very common pets. And there are literally hundreds of forums and YouTube videos on basically every animal you could possibly think of under the sun, because this is a very popular hobby. There are lots of people that love keeping animals. So if you have literally any question, go to a forum and ask it. Do not be scared to ask somebody for something, because at the end of the day, asking for that could help your animal, which is always good. So always ask for information if you can't find it anywhere else, and just do very thorough research before getting an animal. Also, make sure that your information you're getting is up to date, because some information is out of date and it's just not right. For instance, when I was researching into getting my crested gecko, I learned that they apparently ate baby food. And back in the old days, like 18 years ago when they were first being kept, people were actually feeding them baby food because there were no brands making crested gecko food yet. and that was bad for the geckos and they die relatively fast. So make sure whatever information you're getting from YouTube or a forum is not 8 years old. You want to have it be relatively new. And if it is old information, just make sure that that information is still correct. And if you believe it might be incorrect and you can't find anyone saying it's incorrect, then go on a forum and ask somebody if it is or isn't correct. Just make sure you get up-to-date information and don't listen to some guy 10 years ago. This last segment is going to be on where to buy your reptiles. So, me personally, I don't have much experience buying my reptiles online, although I would highly recommend you do buy your reptiles online. I would not recommend you buy them from chain pet stores like Petco, Pet Supermarket. It's just not good. Now, it's not the end of the world if you do buy it from a chain pet store, but just know, if you do, you're not saving the animal, you're just paying for it to be replaced, and giving them money. So, don't buy an animal thinking you're all better than everyone else. You're not. But anyways, so because I don't have much experience, I'm not even going to bother telling you where to buy them from. I would, of course, recommend online, but go research where to buy your own reptiles from, and I do have a video linked in the description below on a guy who seems to know what he's talking about, so you can go watch that video, and that should give you, like, a grasp on where to buy your reptiles from. With everything being said, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video, and if you did, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, go check in my description for my TikTok and Instagram for high-quality footage and photos. See ya!
Three, two, one.